Hello and welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
And hi, I'm Nick Butcher.
Hey there, I'm Mike Denny.
And today we're going to recap all the things that we talked about on the show in 2013. It's been a busy year. We've had something like 20 or something episodes just this year, actually probably more than 20.
This is the 23rd this year.
23rd this year, nice. We've had a busy year, and we're gonna talk about all the different kind of highlights of the show this year.
So I'm sure that you guys have watched them all, but just in case, we're going to pull out some of the highlights that we very much enjoyed bringing to you over the year.
All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So in 2013, we had about 600,000 total views of all of our episodes. About a third of that came from our episode on KitKat, actually about half, which is great. But this is awesome. I'm personally really happy that you guys are finding the show useful, that you're sharing it with your product managers and your designers and your developers, and hopefully, in 2014 we have even greater viewership. So thanks for watching. So with that kind of little bit out of the way, Mike, do you want to jump in with some of our episodes on shared inspiration and maybe some of our rants?
Yeah, definitely. So we were looking back on all the episodes from this past year, and we wanted to kind of group them in general themes. And so I'm going to be talking about a lot of the different inspirational segments that we had on the show. And also some of our rants, where we just kind of go off about how we think things should be, and how people can improve, and how we can help them. So to start with that, I'm going to look at the episode that we did about design workflow. Actually, we had Alex Fayborg from the Android design team on the show, and he walked us through some of the just the general structure that the Android design team here at Google uses in their design process, and this can definitely be helpful if you're looking for a little more structure and process to help you improve in your design practices. As we can see here from these little slide frames, the first couple steps are about sketches, and sketching is great because it gives you a chance to get your ideas out onto paper that you can then share with other stakeholders without committing to anything. So paper is great, but if you don't have access, or if you prefer to do something on the computer, there are definitely a lot of sketching tools available online that you can go check out. And for any of these episodes that we're doing, feel free to go back and watch the whole episode. These are definitely recaps. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and the other thing is that we have slides and not really commentary. I guess we mostly have slides available for each of the episodes. So don't feel like you need to take screenshots or whatever of this show. We have all the slides and all the videos available at androiddesigninaction.com, and we'll mention that link at the very end as well.
Yep. Just wanted to get that out there. So after sketching, after getting some feedback from your coworkers or whoever you're working with, it's great to generate additional ideas as well. And then you can move on to wireframing, which is a little bit more formalized process where, especially for modeling interactions between screens and user flows, more on flows as we see in step 5 there. After you block out the main interactions and UI layouts with wireframes, it's a good next natural step to move on to the more high fidelity or full fidelity mockups in Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever your asset generation tool of choice is. And this is definitely an iterative process. If you go back and look at the full slides, there are about 10 of these full fidelity mockup slides that have all the different iterations of the little header image for the Google Now app that the design team went through during that process. You also want to go back and make sure that you can clearly distinguish and spell out the overall flow through your app. And it helps to visualize that maybe using an artboard in Illustrator with all the multiple screens, so that you can kind of visually show the mental model of your information design in your app. And then red lines are it's just a term to describe the specific metrics and spec for the developers who are going to be implementing the designs that you've created. So that's always helpful to give them just a bunch of assets in addition to specific metrics to spell out, this list item should be 48 dips tall, this padding around should be 16 dips, etc. So the next episode that I want to recap is...
Before we move on, I was going to say that my overriding memory of this kind of design process takeaway was Alex sharing the insight that often the medium you use for kind of expressing your ideas will dictate the kind of feedback you get back. So if you show someone, a very highly designed Photoshop pixel perfect, then you're going to get comments about the shade of blue and the drop shadow size. Whereas if you show someone a sketch, they'll go to town on the basic idea. And I thought that was a really important thing to be cognizant of when you're designing, that to keep the fidelity of the medium in mind. So it kind of just reinforced for me, like, always be sketching, keep sketching as early as possible, and get loads and loads of kind of really base feedback before you move on into some of these more high fidelity mediums.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for pointing that out, Nick. And it's great. So, I mean, obviously, I recently joined the team. I wasn't in almost all of these episodes. So, Rowan and Nick, please feel free to jump in as I'm recapping these with.
We will.
I'm sure you will. One more thing that Alex mentioned as kind of a social engineering hack for any time you present your designs is to show them using the tool you use to create them. So if your manager starts going off on a tangent, I wish that it was just a little bit bigger, you could just go change it right then, and he can decide that if it were bigger, so it would be wrong.
Rather than showing a PDF, basically show them in Illustrator or in Photoshop. Yep. Yeah,
definitely. So moving on, the next episode I'm going to recap is the one in which we presented the apps that were selected to be part of the Beautiful Design collection that we featured in Google Play. This is a fairly regular process that we do here on the team, and it's definitely worth going back to check out those apps to understand why we really, really love them. And it's one of the great things that I think is worth mentioning here is that these aren't apps that were 100% hollow cookie cutter kind of. Mm-hmm. You confuse them with Google standard apps that come with the platform. These were apps that understand the hollow design language, but then extend and go beyond to add real hero moments in their app and to express their brand in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, and in this episode, we really kind of highlighted some of those things. Or maybe one or two of the little details in each app that really made it shine, that really made it stand kind of above, I guess the competition, if you will.
Yeah, and along those same lines, the next app or the next episode that we looked at was in June. We did a bit of a recap on the creation and the design of the Google I/O app, which is actually a really great open source project that we update every year ahead of Google I/O. And we like throwing in latest developments and new features in the platform, and it's definitely a great reference app to go back and look at how a developer can implement the kinds of design principles that we talk about on Ever Design in Action.
Yep, so, and it supports all the best practices, things like support for different screen sizes, use of very, very heavy use of fragments and loaders and things like that. But also it shows a lot about how to style your action bar, how to do interesting things with the action bar. So lots of good little kind of tidbits in that app.
Yep, definitely. So definitely go back and check that out, and also check out the open source project for the Google I/O app.
And that's at code.google.com/p/iOSCHED. I remember that like the back of my hand.
If only we could just, show a link on the screen that you could click.
Yeah, we could probably do that in post.
In addition, if you look at the high definition video on YouTube here, if you scan the QR code at the bottom of the slide there, that'll take you to the Play Store where you can download and play with the app.
Yep. Moving on.
Yeah. So this was a great episode in which Marco and Owen from the Android design team came on and talked about the sweeping redesign, multi-platform redesign of the Google Play apps. So that includes the Play Store itself and all the different media apps that you can use to consume content that you have on Google Play, movies, music, books, etc. So all those apps were redesigned from the ground up with kind of the overarching principles that they were going for being to be responsive, to have modular elements, and also to be familiar and emotionally evocative throughout. So before, if you go back and look at the episode, they show some before. Here I'm only showing the after and kind of the nice look and feel that you guys are used to now. But if you go back and look before, they showed kind of the design fragmentation between the web product, between the tablet and phone products. And so it was definitely a great move to bring everything together, to brand everything in a way that it sets an example for apps outside of Google, especially with the use of color. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss the branding and consistency. Mm-hmm. But it's just a great example of responsive apps where the UI adapts to the screen size. And the UI is very fluid and dynamic based on the device you're using, and it also caters to common use cases on those devices. For example, if I use my phone to download an app, that might be a totally different experience than browsing for a movie to watch on my tablet. So the apps were redesigned with that in mind, especially.
Yeah, and then some of the key things that they use, they describe their use of cards as kind of this inside-out design approach, where the content really adapts to its containers, and they talked a lot about use of I guess the differentiation of these cards of sizes and things to better enforce hierarchy and what's most important, what's most relevant to you, and obviously, Mike, as you said. The use of color is tremendous here across all the Play properties. It really helps kind of establish a sense of place within the entire Play ecosystem. So red if you're in movies, or blue when you're in books, for example.
Yeah, definitely. So you always know where you are. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to point out about cards is I think this is probably the most sweeping implementation of the cards UI that we've seen thus far. I think it started initially with Google Now, and now you can see this kind of card metaphor throughout almost every Google product. That doesn't mean necessarily that you have to put cards in your app. You shouldn't try to force it. I know it's kind of become somewhat of a visual design trend. Just understanding the purpose of the card to kind of encapsulate a single idea or piece of content is a way to use that card metaphor in your designs responsibly.
Yep. So let's move on. And yeah, definitely feel free to check out that episode. There's a lot of good content, specifically about cards. Marco and Owen talk about why they use them. Let's move on to favorite design details. Actually, one thing I wanted to point out is one of the properties that launched after that episode was Google Play Newsstand, or the purple section of Google Play. And that's actually, Marco actually discusses that in this favorite design details episode. So that's Marco up here. It's this guy. Check out his segment of this episode for a discussion on Google Play Newsstand.
Yeah. So Rachel Garb on the top row there, she talked about the Airbnb app. Roman, you talked about Foursquare. Nick talked about Google Chrome and new kind of non-obvious interaction patterns that are kind of like power user features. Rich Fulcher from the design team talked about Libra app, and the Libra app is fantastic in its visualization of data. How they've really made it interactive. So they track the weight you zoom in, zoom out, and you can kind of scale using gestures. It's a great experience. I talked about the Timely app, which is stopwatch, alarm, clock, etc. And Nick talked about, or Adam talked about the Etsy app. So,
actually, quick tidbit there. When Adam and Nick first joined the team, or I think when Adam joined the team, I always confused Adam and Nick. You know why? Because they were both taller than me. But yeah, Mike, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you there so abruptly.
Yeah, and Adam recorded his bit from New York, which is why his little background there looks a little bit different. But one thing I wanted to point out is that only a couple of these were Google apps, and for the third-party apps that we talked about, notice that they weren't pure Google apps. However, they were pure Android apps. So with brand consistency, this is going to be a theme in some of the other things I talk about today. You want to communicate your brand, and you want to also stay pure to Android. So pure Android doesn't necessarily mean that you can't deviate from the design principles, like we encourage to deviate with purpose. So the general overall theme of this episode was that if you put the extra effort in, which a lot of the times takes quite a bit more than just the regular features, to add hero moments, to add just slick animations, beautiful visual presentation, and really easy to understand and use interaction patterns, it'll just make a huge difference overall.
Yep. Should we move on to branding and consistency?
Yep. So I've talked about this a couple times already. I just wanted to illustrate this graph. I don't know who, or this presentation, I don't know if this was...
I think it was Nick that talked about it.
Yeah. Was this
that was me. I was trying to think of a way to express it, and I got the most number of gradients on a slide ever, I think.
Well, when I watched this episode, I felt like you expressed this kind of complex and touchy subject in the most clear to understand way that I've heard it expressed to date. So kudos, Nick. So the idea of this is your information design, your interaction design, and your visual design should kind of have a different balance between your own brand and the Holo or Android visual style and design language. So the information design, the architecture of your app, how information flows throughout your app, and also how a user understands the interactions, the mental model. Those are very, very brandable, and you should express your information design as creatively as you can, and really let your simplicity in your branding shine there. On the other hand, interaction design, you don't want to introduce new interaction patterns for simple navigation or high-level switching between views, because extra stuff that the platform already does for you for free is just going to confuse users, or add steps for them to learn how to use your app, when you should really just be finding the right fit for existing patterns, and where needed, extending those. So it's not necessarily that all the components that we provide in the platform are the only things you should use, right? But if you need a little extra flexibility, you should at least use one of the base components as a starting point. And then for visual design, which is what most people associate with branding, you want to strike a balance. So they pointed out in the episode that the best way probably to use your branding, to highlight your branding in your visual design, is through the use of a branded color. So that's a fantastic example of this is throughout the Play apps, where each Play property has its own color, and that helps between multiple apps to keep you kind of in context of which property you're dealing with at the time. Now, for most people out there, they're not going to be developing a suite of apps like the Play Store. But at the same time, you don't want your user interface to be your brand. the navigation is not the brand. The way this button looks can kind of be your brand. So that's where this slider is kind of halfway in the middle. You want to take the core look and feel of the Holo design language and then extend that. Don't replace the right angle triangle and a spinner drop down with something else. Start with that familiar place, and then you can kind of use those expected metaphors and visual indicators throughout, so that users know exactly how a component, even if it isn't exactly as it looks, they'll know how it can be used, because you're kind of starting at the right place.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Basically, if you're going to make something, you should make your UI elements interesting. You give them some extra, bit of, put in that extra punch of branding, but make sure that they're still very, very familiar, because you really want to lean on what users already know. And what users already know are the things that are in apps like Gmail and Google Keep and Chrome, things like the overflow, things like tabs and the navigation jar. Those things exist, in terms of interaction design. For visual design, you really want to take that and kind of extend Holo, not replace it, not use it wholesale, but really extend it and really kind of pump it with your own sense, with your own branding, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. In the design principle from the Android design guide that really is expressed here is that users should have tricks that they can use everywhere. And so that's what we've been talking about. These little visual indicators that users expect to behave a certain way. Don't go replacing that just because you think it looks cool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to common UX issues.
Yeah, so this was definitely one of our more ranty episodes where
one long rant.
Kind of had there was a top 10 list. We counted it back of really common UX issues or problems that we on the developer relations team see. So part of our everyday job is to review apps internally here at Google and also outside. We work with a lot of you guys to help you improve your apps. And these are just things that we've seen over and over and over. And we felt like going on a rant and spelling them out will hopefully prevent them from spreading to more apps out there in the wild.
Yeah.
So I've pulled out just a couple of these for the full list and the full detailed rant. Definitely check out the episode so that you know what not to do. But things that I wanted to point out were like the navigation is my brand, like I mentioned in the previous for the previous episode. Additional things that can be pretty annoying are showing modal loading dialogues. The best way to deal with loading in data asynchronously over the network is to do it before you show it to the user. So wherever possible. Obviously, that's not possible in every case, especially for real-time updates if a user wants to update a social feed, for example. Mm-hmm. But when presenting a loading indicator, it's best to do it in line, either with the UI element that's currently loading, or somewhere prominent on the action bar, for example, to indicate that something is loading in from the network, but not necessarily a pop-up dialog that blocks all interaction. The worst thing about this is when you override the back button so that you can't cancel the dialog until the loading process actually completes. So that's a big no-no. And you definitely should go through your apps and kind of streamline your use of loading.
Yep.
Yeah, this was a fun top 10. So if you're working on an app, I recommend you go back and look at these top 10 and make sure you're not falling foul of them.
Yeah. Let's move on in the interest of time. So I'm gonna flip through a bunch of best practices, and actually, so those episodes, are very inspirational. We had a bunch of rants. A lot of that is kind of on the less on the education side, I guess, less on the learning about Android, and more about here are the types of things you should be thinking about. In this best practices section, I'm going to talk about some of the episodes, and very briefly, some of the episodes that where we actually shared some best practices, some of our kind of the specifics on how you implement action bars or how you implement navigation jars and things like that. So the first one I want to talk about is units of measure. In this episode, which was actually coupled with newsreader redesign, which Nick will talk about later, we talked specifically about density-independent pixels, how you calculate dips, screen density, grids, basically everything related to a lot of the visual design and layout stuff that you need to know. This is kind of like a visual design 101 for Android, if you will. So if you're just getting started, definitely check out this episode where we talk about units of measure. We also talked about looking at devices in terms of their density-independent pixel resolution rather than their pixel resolution. So for example, the Nexus 7 being 960 by 600 dips, and the Nexus 5 being 640 by 360 dips. And that's a really, really important point if you're getting started doing layout for Android. Moving on, we had another great episode on the onboarding experience, and Nick actually came up with the idea of using a little snowboarder as the icon for this episode.
Very, very proud of that.
And no, I got it. I think we all got it. I think nobody talked about it, but we got it. This episode specifically talked about a bunch of the different ways in which you can mess up, and not only mess up, but also improve the getting started experience for your app. So things like speed bump tutorials and basically avoiding those, requiring registration, splash screens, basically getting bootstrapped with the app. We talked about lots of things there. One of my favorite things that we did was we talked about some of the examples. One of my favorite apps in this space is Tumblr. It actually lets you do so much without signing in or registering or anything. You open up the app and you're immediately given the full app, the full UI, the full experience. You can even start following blogs or following Tumblr blogs before you log in. So it's just a great example of that. And then we also briefly talked about over-the-air install with the Google Plus integration stuff. So
this was a fun episode because it's one of my bugbear kind of subjects. I kind of like to think that there's a funnel of people trying to use your app, and every time you do one of these kind of anti-patterns, the funnel gets smaller and you lose a few users. So it's really kind of like interesting exercise to critically look at your startup flow and see where you are potentially going to lose some people.
Yep, for sure. The next best practice thing that we talked about, again in the area of visual design, was launcher icons. And this episode was coupled with a football apps, or soccer apps as we say here in the States, soccer or football apps redesign. So in this section, in this episode, we talked about some best practices for designing launcher icons, the sizes, the amount of spacing you should use, also the perspective you should use, and specifically the density of assets. So this is one thing that still keeps coming up. Don't forget to include XX HDPI assets for launcher icons. And in the new world of Nexus 5 and larger icons on the Nexus 5 launcher, there should actually be also XXX HDPI. So definitely make sure to check out this episode if you're designing launcher icons. Moving on, we did another episode basically doing a 101 on the action bar. I'm guessing if you've been watching this show, or if this is your first episode, then thanks for watching. But if you have learned anything about Android so far, or Android design so far, you've probably learned a little bit about the action bar. In this episode, we dove into quite a bit of detail on the action bar, the general organization, which things should go where, navigation on the left, actions on the right. We talked about some guidelines for how many actions you should show. And then we also talked about branding. And this is kind of that recurring theme that Mike was talking about earlier. Here are some of the ways in which you can start introducing your branding into the app. And the action bar is a key area for that. So we highlighted some ways in which you can introduce your brand color schemes.
Yeah, the action bar is one of those fundamental patterns that we say you should probably deviate with purpose. So unless you've got a really good reason not to be using it, you probably should be using one. So if you're not 100% sure about how and when to use it, then check out this episode.
Yep. So after the action bar, we invited Jens Nagel and Rich Fulcher from the Android design team, and we talked about Rich earlier. He was talking about the Libra app in our favorite design details episode. But Jens and Rich, back in June, they talked about the navigation drawer. And this was right after Google I/O, where we announced the navigation drawer pattern and a bunch of the support, the framework support for it. But in this episode, Jens and Rich dove very deeply into the interaction design aspects of the navigation drawer. So things like, what should the back button do? How should you represent your information hierarchy in the navigation drawer? They talked about things like collapsible sections. I guess they talked about hubs, navigational hubs, that are kind of like deeper sections of your app that should still be accessible within the drawer. So they talked about a whole bunch of details there that's actually some pretty good information on top of what's in the design guide. So if you're building a navigation drawer, definitely check out this episode. So the next episode we did was on collections, and specifically we showed some, we talked about some best practices by way of examples on how lots of apps right now are doing things right in terms of displaying, letting you search and filter, and so on, collections, as well as mutate, things like adding items to a collection, removing items from a collection, reordering, taking action on items, things like that. So we talked about some things like distillation, things like search and filter, having a right side filter drawer. We talked about responsive layout, basically switching from lists to a grid to a staggered grid, like here in an example of Pocket. We talked about how different apps let you act on items using things like the contextual action bar, as well as secondary actions and item overflows. Reordering items like using a drag grip on the side, or Google Keep, which is actually an excellent example of collections, displaying and modifying collections of notes in this case, how they actually use drag and drop to let you reorder. So this episode really, in summary, it was really just kind of a smorgasbord almost of different ways in which apps are doing things great in terms of collections. Okay, moving on. The next best practice episode type thing that we had was one on images that we did back in October. And here we talked about the different ways in which you can actually do interesting things with images. So we talked about some best practices like how to show text overlays when showing banner images or thumbnails. We talked about placeholders. In this example, we talked about how Pinterest does a great job of actually keying the placeholder a color based on the image. So it seems like they store another bit almost in the database of the key color in the image, and they show that color before the image itself loads. So it gives you a little touch of context as to what's going to show up in that space. We also talked about the center cropping technique, which is a great way to basically allow your UIs to scale to different aspect ratios. And in the center cropping technique, you basically, it's actually very simple to use. You actually just set the scale type to center crop on an image view. But in this technique, you basically chop off either to the left and right or the top and bottom of an image if the aspect ratio of the image and its target destination don't match. And we also talked about focus, things like using blurring and dimming techniques to help the user really focus on the most important things, whether it be the text in front or grayscaling an image if it's not important, things like that. So overall, we just touched on a bunch of different best practices and a couple of ideas on how to present images. So moving on, we did another episode on best practices for presenting maps in your app. So we talked about things like the different ways in which users can interact or should be able to interact with a map, the different ways in which you can present and allow interaction with markers and info windows. And we spent some time talking about the visual design of markers, basically how you can introduce branding into something that is, from a shape standpoint, the shape of a marker is generally pretty standard. But how you can actually introduce some of your branding into that, as well as how to deal with density. If you have tons and tons of markers, how can you actually still allow the user to see the map underneath all the markers? So we talked about that for quite a bit. We talked about full screen, and I'll get to that in a second. We talked about an embedded map mode, which Foursquare does really well with. But we talked a bit about full screen, and actually in Android 4.4, we also talked about translucent navigation and status bars, and these actually go hand in hand. Another thing that we talked about in the Android 4.4 episode was map padding. So actually in recent versions of the map library, you can offset these controls, like the zoom control as well as the compass and my location control. You can actually offset those and still show the map above and below those controls. So it really helps when presenting a map in this kind of more full screen or more immersive mode. Before we move on, I've been talking a lot. You guys have any comments on maps or anything like that?
No, you're doing a great job.
All right, let's plow ahead. We did another episode on home screen widgets. This was back in March. And in this episode, we talked about the different types of home screen widgets, things like information-only widgets, like your current weather, or control widgets, like the power control, hybrid widgets, and collection widgets. We talked about the different kind of patterns for content to show inside of a widget. We also, not pictured in these thumbnails here, we talked about some of the constraints, like things you just can't do with widgets, like you can't play videos in widgets, unfortunately. But we did talk about some of the things you can do, like you can actually allow for configuration of a widget. So one of the great things about widgets is that they let a user take a bit of your app and put it on their home screen, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on their device. And one of the best ways to have a successful widget is to allow customization, really let the user make it their own. We also talked about some best practices for sizing. Basically, when you're designing the layout for a widget, we talked about some formulas you can use to roughly figure out how big it should be.
I think one of the most important things we touched on there, which perhaps isn't quite as well documented as I'd like in our design guidelines, is the fact that you're sharing some real estate. So while your app has the full range of expression of its brand and so forth, when it's taking over the whole screen, when you're creating a widget, you have to kind of bear in mind the context that will be presented next to other widgets or other app icons. So I think that was a really important section in that episode. It's how you can design your widget so that it will go along with those other home screen items.
Yeah, specifically the visual design of the widget. It's more important to be on that slider of branding and consistency, more important than in your app to be closer to the Android and Hollow end of that spectrum when you're designing a widget, because it's next to everything else.
Yeah, but we love widgets. It can make an app stand out and really differentiate your app from the crowd.
All right, moving on. We did a little bit of, in the section where we talked about the I/O app, in the episode where we talked about the I/O app, we also talked about sharing and full screen UIs. So sharing, I'm not going to get into too much depth here, but we talked about the different ways in which you can allow users to share content. Things like the shared dialogue, that's very standard. Things like the share action provider in the action bar. The idea here is, the big message here is that you should really allow sharing to anything that's on the user's device, not just specifically to like 2 social networks or 1 social network. You should really kind of use whatever the system has installed. So keep that in mind when designing sharing UIs. In the full screen, I guess, area, we talked about system bars, things like the status bar and the navigation bar. And then we talked a whole bunch about different interesting ways in which you can use those bars, having like an overlaid action bar or dimming out the status bar and the navigation bar. Lots of different interactions you can create here. And these were, we talked about them even more depth in our in a later episode. I think it was the KitKat episode, when we introduced immersive mode in KitKat. We talked about some of the even newer ways you can do really, really full screen, really immersive UIs. So if you're building a full screen experience like a video player or a full screen game or a book reader or even a photo gallery, definitely make sure to check out this episode from June 4th, as well as the KitKat episode, which was very recent. All right, moving on. I think we're at the end. Yeah, this is the last. This is my last slide here. The last kind of best practice and best practice type episode that we had was about design tools. So in this episode, we talked a lot about the different tools that the designers on the Android team use. Things like obviously Illustrator, Fireworks, Photoshop. But we also talked about some of the some of the interaction, I guess some of the wireframing tools that you have available to you as an Android designer. Things like OmniGraph, Fluid UI, Proto.io. We kind of did a compare and contrast sort of those different interaction design tools. And there are probably countless more today than there were back when we did this episode. But if you're looking for kind of a getting started guide on which tools you should get started with, definitely this is a good episode. One last thing is we briefly talked about the Android Design Preview tool, which lets you mirror something from your computer, from like a Photoshop window to your device. You can see it live. And we talked about things like the Android Asset Studio and Hollow Colors Generator and Action Bar Style Generator that let you basically create all the assets you need for the basics of your Android app. Things like the action bar background and things like that. And
tooling's always an emotive subject. I mean, people feel passionate about their tools, and it's interesting some of the feedback we got from the episode and some new tools have emerged. I think for me, Sketch is one of the tools which is on my list of tools to check out. A lot of people are saying they're having a lot of success using that for kind of a vector-based design.
For sure. Okay, and I think that about covers it for the best practices section. Nick, do you want to talk about all the redesigns and mockups we did in 2013?
Yeah, absolutely. So redesigns are kind of very much in the kind of DNA of the Android Design in Action show. It's kind of the in action part where we like to kind of show rather than just talk about things. So while they take a lot of time and we haven't been able to do quite as many as perhaps we'd like, it's been some really fun shows where we've managed to either reimagine certain apps out there or take a look at like a hypothetical app, what it might look like. So I'm going to take you through some of our favorite redesigns. So all the way back in January, the first, your favorite meat-flavored reader app, the first time we introduced it, this was an episode where we introduced this idea of iterative design. So it was really fun to take an application which had like zero styling applied to it at all, just had some raw content in there, and walk you through the steps that we would do to improve things like applying themes and applying the metrics in the Android Design Guide and taking a look at typography and literally build it up step by step. As you can see as Roman pans around here, to go from something which looks completely bare, doesn't look like an Android app, you're not exactly sure how to use it, to something which looks really attractive and communicates its information hierarchy and really sells the content. So if you haven't checked this out, this is probably one of my all-time favorite episodes of Android Design in Action. Really breaks down how you go about improving your application.
Yeah, and the one thing we try to do throughout is talk about some of the developer features that we used. So in the bottom right of a lot of the slides, there was a little kind of for developers note. So keep that in mind if you're a developer.
Yeah, absolutely. Next episode I want to talk about is in February. We took a look at football, not soccer, football apps, in particular the application LiveScore Addicts. And we reimagined what it could look like by applying some more of the Android design guidelines. So we did a lot of things we normally do, like kind of applying a more Android-y kind of flatter look and feel and using action bars and so forth, which I think instantly, it made it look more like an Android app to me. It made it communicate its purpose, its interaction patterns much clearer for me after the redesign, so I was a fan of that. But the two things I wanted to mostly pull out here, the kind of slightly larger pictures, are I really enjoyed with this redesign taking a look at the navigation, the way the major navigation was organized, because they were previously using a drawer which kind of seemed to, there wasn't too many major sections to this application. So by kind of flattening down the kind of navigation hierarchy, we were able to move it over to using a tab-based interface with lesser used functions tucked away under the overflow, like settings. And that instantly was much clearer. I think if you can use a tab-based navigation which immediately communicates the app's purpose to a user, or using the action bar spinner, sorry, not tabs, then I thought this was a great, great stepping back exercise and not using a drawer just because it's attractive or new hotness, but actually thinking of the simplest way to communicate the section.
Yep.
So that was really fun.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of this, we also did a bit with the color scheme. We talk a lot about single accent colors, like a lot of the Play properties use a single accent color. In this case, we actually, in the redesign, we decided to use 2 accent colors, this kind of, I guess, desaturated dark brown and almost like a forest green. So, don't feel like you should be limited to a single accent color. If it makes sense for your app to use 2 accent colors, absolutely feel free to do that. Here's just one example of how we did that.
Yeah, that was great. Moving on. So in March, we took a look at how you might create a hypothetical newsreader. So we built on top of this kind of XYZ, this kind of meaty reader, and explored some interesting ways in which you can, do news reading experiences. So there's some fun stuff, explorations in there, things like using multi-finger gestures in order to kind of peek more content, leading to kind of a lighter weight process and so forth. I was really interested in the use of search to flatten the hierarchy. I thought that was really interesting. A lot of applications struggle with how do you communicate a really, really complicated hierarchy of topics and so forth, and using search and kind of customization to flatten and navigate that, I thought was a fun approach to it. That was very good.
One brief thing I want to mention is this mockup was done before we had the official navigation drawer pattern. So some of the mockups, some of the designs you see here are actually not quite up to date in terms of how you should use the navigation drawer.
Oh yeah, bulldozing content. What's that all about? Yeah. But lastly, I think that the kind of the bottom right image slide here I've captured, I very much enjoyed the discussion we had around focusing on content, because kind of these news reading apps, it's all about content, right? It's all about presenting and getting users to a story they want to read, and the little interface design things that you can do to make that reading experience, the reason that they're more pleasant, can really help. So we played with some ideas around hiding the action bar, about when to surface new content, about going into this kind of lights out mode, as we call it, where you dim any other distractions in the UI. I thought that was really fun to kind of like really have a laser focused application, so that was good.
Yep. Moving on.
Next up was an episode in March where we took a look at what a hypothetical podcast creator app might look like. So this was an app where we kind of mocked it up and designed. But stepping back from that, I really enjoyed that we started from kind of a stage before the mock-ups and redesigns, if you will. We started from the information hierarchy and really kind of like took some time to think about what it was this app was trying to achieve and how that would influence the screen design later on. So I really enjoyed that we kept the information model, and in fact we used little labels throughout the design to show which screens were ticking off certain use cases we were trying to cover off. So that was a fun episode, which I don't think I was there for, but I did enjoy watching it.
Moving on.
Moving on. In July, we took a look at an application called fin.no.
This is actually from GDG Oslo, I believe. We did kind of a live app clinic, I guess, with the creators of this app, and then they were like, "Hey, can you show us some ideas on, or show some mock-ups of what how you would design this?" So we went ahead and did that.
Yeah, that was a fun one. So I think there was some really nice work done to better express the kind of information hierarchy, some general reorganization there, as well as moving some of the kind of interface patterns like the action bar and the navigation drawer a bit closer to the the platform pattern in order to kind of make them feel more intuitive, so that users can kind of pick up the application and know how to navigate around, which I thought was really nice. But the one thing I wanted to highlight in this application, we touched on it just a couple of minutes ago, talking about information collections, was the use of a right side drawer for the sorting option. So I very much enjoyed this. I think this is a great way to kind of bundle up and your sorting options, and it can feel like a lighter weight action rather than taking users off to a second screen or a dialogue perhaps. So letting them kind of set their sorting options, and better yet, if you can have them, say, updating the background, so I could see as I move that slider left or right, if I could see the number of results, like changing the background. I think it's a really, really nice way to make it feel like I'm directly working on this data, rather than it's this slow machinery process that I'm pulling a lever and that's causing a process to kick off somewhere else. So I thought that was a really, really nice touch in that episode.
Yep.
Moving on. So
we did a lot of redesigns this year.
Yeah, it was fun. Okay, we did a few. In July, we took a look at a hypothetical cricket app. So this is off the back of Rito Meyer did an excellent episode of the App Clinic, talking about his ideal sports app and how you would build it. but we then picked up the ball off of him and then talked about how we might go around styling that. And much in the vein of the iterative design process, we took this application step by step. So we looked at, the information density and the typography and the visual theming and so on, and built it up step by step, talking through why we were making the changes and how you change them. And then we kind of went one step further as well, and showed an example of how you might redline such a design to communicate all of these design decisions from a designer to a developer. So that was a fun episode.
Yep, very fun episode. And I think that was it for the redesigns that year, right? This year.
Yeah, we ran out of steam in July, it seems.
Yeah, they take quite a bit of time, right? They're pretty time consuming. They are very fun, but very time consuming. All right.
Yeah.
So the and more section, we had a couple of episodes that didn't really fall into any of those three themes that we did want to talk about. Nick, do you want to jump into those?
Yeah, absolutely. So in May, just after the conference itself, we took some time to talk about what happened at Google I/O, and in particular to highlight some of the sessions that will be most relevant to designers working on Android applications. So I put out a few slides here. So 3 of my favorite talks from Google I/O 2013 were this top row of slides here. So that's talking about Android's design principles. The second one was talking about Alex Warburg again, friend of the show, shall we say, talking about cognitive science. Just a fascinating talk, and really kind of one of those talks that gets in your head and sticks with you, and you kind of keep thinking about it as you're working on your design. Mm-hmm. And the third one I've highlighted there is Rich and Jens again, who did similar as we were just talking about in the podcast creation. They kind of focus on the process, like about going back to first principles and thinking about your information model and how you flesh it out and kind of take the process of taking that and turning it into use cases and then into kind of like screen design and so forth. So those are some of my favorite talks. I also wanted to highlight that we had a wonderful session of, called it kind of Android Design in Action Live, where we had some very, very kind of like amazing TAs or helpers from the Android Design in Action community. So shout out to you guys, you're awesome, who came along and helped us to run a session talking about the kind of things we talk about the show, about how to take an idea and flesh it out into an information model and then sketch to create interesting apps. And that was just phenomenal. We weren't quite sure how it was going to work, but I was blown away with the passion and the kind of the ideas that people brought to that session. So that was really, really fun. Unfortunately, not a recorded show at I/O, but maybe something we can do again one day.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely have to record an episode or record a session like that, and we do have all the materials online. So if you actually want to run through the same, I guess, problem that we ran through, the same, I guess, question, the same task we ran through, that material is all available online.
And the last one I pulled out, maybe it's more of a plug because it was a Roman and I session where we took off our designer hats and put on our developer hats and instead talked about how developers in the audience can actually go about creating all these things. So rather than the kind of principles and the visual design, but how you actually go about implementing them. So one more for the developer audience.
Okay, and
lastly, I think as Roman alluded to, somehow our breakout success of the year, by view count at least, in October we did a show recapping some of the more interesting things in KitKat for a design audience. So some of the things I've highlighted here on this slide, talking about the changes to kind of the different immersive or full screen modes that you can use, including the translucent bar mode, so where you can actually draw behind some of the system chrome. We talked about the changes in branding, about how KitKat has tried to reduce the kind of high contrast, like bringing attention to kind of less important things like touch feedback. Instead, they're trying to make those more subtle, allowing your room more space to kind of like use color for expressing things which are important or require emphasis, rather than for kind of like these highly kind of like jarring, responses to gestures and so on, touches and so on. Sorry. We also covered some of the newer documented patterns. So these are gestures, sorry, which have been codified, I guess, in the design guidelines. So things like the double touch drag, which you'll find It's a great gesture for like single-handed zooming, and you'll find it in things like Chrome and Maps and so forth. So that's a great pattern to gesture to look at. As well as not really a design feature, but something that's really worth being aware of is the new ability in KitKat to record, to grab videos of your from the device. So this is a great way for, you know, if you're going to get your developer to prototype something and record a video of it, and you can like pass it around to get feedback from people. It's a really handy tool to have in your toolbox.
Yep, for sure. So that's it for Android Design in Action in 2013. As you can see, we had quite a long year, 23 episodes, was it? You know, we talked a lot about some inspirational things. We went on quite a few long rants, especially in that common UX issues episode. We did a bunch of redesigns and mockups, and of course we shared some best practices, some of the specifics on how to use an action bar, navigation drawer, and so on. So,
it's really fun actually stepping back and looking at the kind of different things we did. So do let us know in the comments or on Google Plus or Twitter or whatever, which kind of aspect you enjoyed, or if you enjoy a balance, or what you want to see more of in the future.
Yeah, and if there's something that we haven't done on the show before that you think would be cool, definitely let us know in the comments as well.
Yeah, we have a bunch of ideas, but we need even more ideas, so definitely let us know. So with that, see you in 2014. God, 2014 sounds like such a weird thing, but it's like it's tomorrow. It's not really tomorrow. It's just a few days away.
The future is now.
The future is now. All right, with that, as always, I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
And bye from me, Nick Butcher.
I'm Mike Denny. See ya.
See you guys in 2014.